In this episode, we turn to a subject that often seems administrative at first, but quickly reveals itself as one of the most practical ways to protect systems from avoidable disruption. Change management is about controlling how modifications are introduced into technology environments so that needed improvements can happen without creating unnecessary outages, confusion, or hidden risk. For a beginner, that may sound like a formal process built mainly for large organizations, yet the underlying idea is simple and universal. Whenever someone updates software, replaces hardware, changes a network setting, modifies access, or adjusts a business application, that action can help the organization or harm it, depending on how carefully it is handled. A mature environment does not treat change as something to fear, but it also does not assume that every change will go smoothly just because the intention is good. The real goal is to make change predictable, reviewable, and recoverable so the business can keep moving without losing stability. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. At its core, change management is the structured process used to request, assess, approve, implement, document, and review changes to systems and services. The word change includes far more than major technology projects. It can involve a routine software update, a new firewall rule, a database adjustment, a server replacement, a modification to an application setting, or a change to how users access a service. What makes this important is that even small actions can have wide effects in connected environments. One setting altered in the wrong place can interrupt a business application, weaken a control, or create confusion for support teams that were not informed. Change management exists to reduce those surprises. It creates a common method so people understand what is being altered, why it is being altered, who reviewed the risk, when the work will happen, and what should be done if the outcome is not what was expected. One reason this process matters so much is that organizations depend on change constantly. Technology cannot remain frozen if the business expects better performance, stronger security, compliance with new requirements, and support for new products or services. Systems must be patched, upgraded, expanded, repaired, and adapted as needs evolve. At the same time, every change introduces uncertainty because the environment before the change and the environment after the change are not exactly the same. That is the tension at the heart of this topic. Businesses need improvement, but they also need reliability. Change management is the discipline that helps balance those two realities. Instead of allowing people to make adjustments whenever they feel ready, the process slows down the risky parts just enough to ask the right questions before service is affected. In that way, change management is not bureaucracy for its own sake. It is a practical way of protecting stability while still allowing progress. A helpful beginner lesson is that many major incidents are not caused by mysterious outside forces. They often trace back to internal changes that were made without enough review, testing, communication, or planning. An application may fail after a seemingly routine update. A network service may become unavailable after one dependency was overlooked. A new access rule may accidentally block legitimate users while trying to solve a different issue. These events are especially frustrating because they are self-inflicted. The organization created its own disruption while trying to improve something else. Change management reduces that risk by bringing discipline to decisions that might otherwise be made too casually. It asks whether the change is understood, whether the timing makes sense, whether the business impact has been considered, and whether recovery is possible if results are worse than expected. The process does not guarantee perfect outcomes, but it makes careless disruption far less acceptable and far less likely. The process usually begins with a formal request for change, which is simply the organization's way of making sure a proposed modification is visible before someone starts touching a live environment. A good request explains what is being changed, why the change is needed, which systems or services are affected when the work is proposed, and what result is expected if the change is successful. That may sound basic, yet it is surprisingly important because many weak changes begin with vague intentions such as improving performance or applying an update without clearly identifying scope or impact. A well-described request creates a shared understanding that others can review. It also provides the starting point for later questions about risk, approval, communication, and accountability. Without that initial clarity, teams may move ahead based on assumptions, and those assumptions often break down at exactly the moment when careful coordination matters most. Good change management starts by making the proposed action understandable to others. After the request is made, the organization must assess the change rather than treating every modification as equally safe or equally dangerous. This assessment asks what could go wrong, who could be affected, how broad the impact might be, and how difficult recovery would be if the change fails. A simple update to a low-priority internal tool does not carry the same risk as a modification to a payment system, an identity platform, or a production database that supports multiple business services. Effective change management, therefore, depends on classification. Some organizations describe routine, low-risk activities as standard changes, while more carefully reviewed work is treated as normal change, and urgent work needed to restore service may be treated as emergency change. The labels matter less than the idea behind them. The process should reflect risk and urgency. When everything is treated the same way, either the process becomes too slow for routine work or too weak for high-impact work. Good design means matching the level of control to the level of potential harm. Risk and impact assessment should go beyond the immediate technical task and consider the wider environment in which the change will occur. A change may look harmless when viewed in isolation, yet become much riskier when its dependencies are understood. An update to one application may affect a database, a reporting tool, a login service, an interface with another business unit, or a batch job that runs later in the evening. That is why mature teams ask not only what is being changed, but what else depends on it, and what business process may be interrupted if something behaves unexpectedly. They also think about timing. A change that would be tolerable on a quiet weekend may be unacceptable during payroll processing, student registration, month-end closing, or a major customer event. For beginners, this is one of the most important ways to think like an auditor or risk-aware operator. The danger of a change is not just in the technical act itself. It is in the business consequences that follow if the act does not go as planned. Approval is another essential part of the process because changes should not move into production simply because the person proposing them feels confident. Approval creates a checkpoint where others review whether the change is justified, whether the risks are acceptable, whether the timing is appropriate, and whether required preparation has actually been completed. In some organizations, significant changes are reviewed by a Change Advisory Board, CAB, which is a group that brings together technical, operational, and sometimes business perspectives before important work proceeds. The purpose of approval is not to embarrass the change owner or block progress for the sake of control. It is to create informed oversight. When approval is weak or rushed, people may miss obvious conflicts, dependencies, or readiness problems. When approval is too vague, no one can later explain who accepted the risk or why the change was allowed to proceed. Strong approval practices show that the organization understands both accountability and the need for shared judgment. Testing is one of the clearest signs that change management is being taken seriously. Before a change is introduced into a live environment, the organization should have some reasonable basis for believing the change will behave as intended. That does not mean every small action requires a massive simulation, but it does mean important changes should not rely purely on optimism. Testing helps teams see whether the change works, whether performance remains acceptable, whether related systems still function properly, and whether security or control settings were affected in ways no one expected. Just as important, the people performing the test should not always be the only ones deciding whether the results are good enough. Segregation of duties matters here because the same person who designs and applies a change should not have unchecked control over every part of review and validation. Independent review adds discipline and reduces the chance that enthusiasm or haste will hide a serious weakness until users experience it directly. Communication often determines whether a technically sound change is experienced as orderly or chaotic by the rest of the organization. Even a well-planned change can create confusion if users, support teams, business owners, and affected partners do not know what is happening or when it is happening. Good communication explains the purpose of the change, the planned timing, the expected effect on service, the duration of any interruption, and who should be contacted if the outcome is not what was expected. It also helps support teams prepare for questions and gives business leaders enough visibility to manage downstream effects. This matters because change management is not only about the technology itself. It is also about setting expectations so that ordinary effects of planned work are not mistaken for unexpected failure. In high-impact environments, communication can prevent unnecessary escalation, reduce rumor, and preserve confidence that the organization is operating with control rather than surprising people with unexplained disruptions. Another critical feature of good change management is implementation planning, which means thinking ahead about how the work will actually be carried out under real conditions. A change should not enter production as a vague intention such as upgrade system tonight and see how it goes. The plan should identify who will perform the work, what sequence of actions will occur, what prerequisites must already be true, how success will be validated, and what checkpoint decisions must be made if the outcome begins to drift away from expectations. Scheduling is part of this discipline because poorly timed changes can multiply business impact even when the underlying work is technically correct. An organization should consider peak business periods, staffing levels, dependency windows, and the availability of the right people if rapid response is needed. Change management becomes far more effective when implementation is treated as a controlled event rather than as an informal task squeezed in whenever someone happens to have time. One of the most valuable concepts for beginners is the backout plan, sometimes called a rollback plan. This is the organization's prepared method for returning to a known good state if the change produces unexpected problems or fails to deliver the intended result. The backout plan exists because confidence is not the same thing as certainty. Even careful review and testing cannot eliminate all risk, especially in complex environments where real production conditions may differ from pre-change assumptions. A strong change process therefore asks in advance how the organization will recover, how long that recovery should take, what data or settings must be preserved, and who has authority to decide that the change should be reversed. This kind of planning protects the business from hesitation during a stressful moment. Without a backout plan, teams may keep struggling with a failing change simply because they have no organized way to retreat. Good change management treats recovery planning as part of responsible execution, not as an admission of weakness. Documentation supports every stage of the process because it preserves organizational memory and allows others to understand what happened long after the change window has closed. The request, the assessment, the approvals, the test results, the communication plan, the implementation record, and the final outcome should all be captured in a way that others can review later. This matters for practical reasons, not just compliance reasons. Support teams need to know what changed when troubleshooting later issues. Managers need to know whether repeated disruptions are linked to particular kinds of changes. Auditors need evidence that important work was reviewed and controlled. Future change owners may also need to understand what succeeded or failed in the past, so they do not repeat the same mistake. In that sense, documentation turns individual actions into organizational knowledge. When change records are poor, the environment becomes harder to govern because decisions disappear into memory, and lessons learned do not stay available to the people who need them next. After implementation, mature organizations do not simply assume success because the change window ended without obvious disaster. They perform some form of post-implementation review to confirm whether the change achieved its objective, whether any unintended effects appeared, whether the communication and timing were appropriate, and whether the approval and testing approach was sufficient for the level of risk involved. This review is especially valuable when a change caused disruption, but it is also useful when the change succeeded because success can still teach the organization which practices are working well. Over time, these reviews support continuous improvement. Teams begin to see patterns, such as certain services producing repeated change-related incidents, certain times being poor choices for implementation, or certain approval steps being too weak to catch dependency issues. Change management becomes stronger when it is treated as a learning system rather than a one-time checklist. Each completed change adds information that can refine future decisions and reduce future disruption. From an audit and governance perspective, change management processes reveal a great deal about how seriously an organization treats operational control. An auditor is not there to approve every change, but should be able to assess whether changes are requested, evaluated, approved, tested, documented, implemented, and reviewed in a consistent way that matches business risk. Weak environments often show familiar warning signs. Emergency changes become common because planning is poor, documentation is completed after the fact or not at all, approvals are unclear, and repeated incidents trace back to uncontrolled modifications. Stronger environments show the opposite. They can explain who approved a significant change, what risk was identified, what testing occurred, how the implementation was communicated, and what was learned afterward. For a new learner, this is the core insight. Change management is not about resisting change. It is about introducing change in a way that protects service, supports accountability, and keeps improvement from becoming a source of avoidable harm.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.